Welcome. I'm sorry we're a little late in starting, but there was an overrun, as you know, at the initial session there, which I'm sure you found as stimulating as I did. My name's Gus Macdonald. I was Minister of Transport in the United Kingdom for a couple of very turbulent years. Most of the time since, I've been with Macquarie, which is the Australian financial company, which is probably the biggest private sector investor and operator in infrastructure globally. So I've also been involved for the last 5 years or so with the OECD in its various future programs on infrastructure needs. And our initial report looked at infrastructure needs until 2030 and found a huge gap between the growing demand and the ability of governments to match that demand. A gap that ran into tens of trillions of dollars and was expanding by the year, and that was before the global financial crisis. The OECD have just completed another survey which looks at transport connections intercontinentally up until 2050. And again, the gap is still widening, and in some areas of transport, as we heard in the initial session, the growth in transport demand is outpacing the growth in GDP quite markedly. In areas like containers, for instance, it's about 3 times the rate of GDP in terms of its increase. So the demands will be remarkable. And as you see in the outline of our agenda, we're saying, is there a chronic funding problem for transport? Why is that? And one of the reasons, again, you had it mentioned in the initial session, is simply as a result of democracy in many cases. That if you ask people what their priorities are, they will tell you that their priorities are about health, education, care for the elderly, law and order, and infrastructure might be pretty far down the list. And of course, for politicians working in a political cycle of 4 years until their next election, the planning and construction cycle of infrastructure takes it well out of synchronization with their ambitions, and therefore it's much easier to sweat the assets, and the assets in transport have been regularly sweated in almost every country by politicians under pressure. Now, what we want to look at today is whether there is relief coming from increased private investment. And of course, private investment is already very large in many countries because we've got privatized aviation and airports and much of the transport sector just in the UK where I come from. But there's also the question of whether more money can be raised from the private sector, which would have been needed anyway, according to the OECD, despite the global financial crisis. And that obviously has shaken governments very badly, and it's also curbed the enthusiasm of the private sector in some areas, but the animal spirits do seem to be reviving again there. And if we look at what the options are, and you'll hear more of this obviously from our panelists, we're looking to privatization. There's been over $1 trillion worth of privatization across over 100 countries in the last couple of decades. There could be an awful lot more, and as you can see, the pressure is on, particularly in European countries that are under fiscal pressures, to privatize many of their transport assets. There's also the question of user charging and whether we should be moving towards that, either to help the funding of infrastructure or for more rational allocation of resources. Is there an argument for increasing prices? Are we wrong to subsidize transport quite so much? Is there any areas of waste that we can identify in the private sector or the public sector in transport? And can we do more with less, or must we reconcile ourselves to doing less with less? Now, just to end my introduction, let me say that from the private sector financial markets, if we look at the capital at the moment, there's a massive supply of capital looking for investment in infrastructure. Some of it's coming from infrastructure funds, some from sovereign wealth funds. But out there, you've got an institutional sector with about $65 trillion worth of assets, and the OECD, again, is recommending that we look to a way of tapping into pension funds and other institutional pots of money there. So the supply of capital at the moment, chasing infrastructure, is larger than the pool of assets that are available for sale. So one has to ask, if a lot more privatization or PPPs take place, will that help to balance the demand and supply in terms of investment? Now, the credit quality of a lot of the assets that might be coming in the market is strong. The debt availability is there for them. The underwriting deals are coming back. There's a willingness to take risk in the private sector. The bond markets are particularly hot at the moment, rather than just the debt markets. And the transport assets have proven to be reasonably resilient throughout the financial crisis. So the risk appetite is about the same as it was before the global financial crisis. And there is a lot of refinancing just waiting to happen in the next few years, but it looks as though the money will be there to satisfy it. So that's just my way of introduction from my areas of special interest. Let me just introduce you one by one to our panel. I've asked them to speak for about 4 minutes each and just what they see to be the priorities at the moment on the agenda that you have before us. So I'll go along the panel here, and if they're each speaking for about 4 minutes, in total we should have about half an hour of those statements. Then we'll have a general discussion on the panel and also comments from the floor. So let me start on the far left here with Urban Karlström, who is from Sweden, background in the Ministry of Finance, and present position as chairman of the Swedish Forum for Innovation and Strategies in the Transport sector. Urban, your priorities in 4 minutes.
In the financial, with the financial issues, I will start my remarks with some comments from that perspective. And it's obvious that the last years has really seen the problems of the integrated global financial market. But on the other hand, we have realized the importance of a well-functioning financial market, capital markets, and how we can benefit from it when the markets are functioning well. It connects long-term saving with long-term investment, not at least in the sector of transport. It allocates cost over time, especially important for investments that are really long-term, as we are facing in the transport sector. What we see now, I think, is a process of re-regulation, hopefully on an international level of the financial markets, increasing capital requirements, making the supervision more well-functioning, all with the aim and purpose to increase the transparency. And I think that is important, not at least for the different financial instruments that we can be using in the financial sector, and to stabilize and to guarantee, if we can, the financial stability. We will gain, all of us, not at least in transport sector, to keep, to preserve, to have a well-balanced international capital market for our needs. The financial crisis did have a second round of effects, especially on the governments. We see a lot of governmental financial problems in governments all around. More severe in some countries than in others. For instance, in Sweden we had our big problems with financing the state budget in the 90s. We learned that lessons. It took a long time to restructure and to come back to a balanced situations. And I think that will be the case in many countries all around the world. And that will have severe problems on the capability of financing, not at least investments in the private in the transport sector. So we are really facing some problems. That's my opinion.